lead paint. Is it really dangerous? We hear so much in our business. We have to deal with it all the time with disclosure forms. And we're really talking about properties that are pre-1978. So what is lead paint?
Well, lead paint by definition is, a paint that has a certain percent or higher of lead in it. Lead paint itself is safe. Lead dust is not. So when lead paint chips, peels, flakes, gets on the floor, so it falls to the floor, it's turned into dust. The kids play on the floor, put their hands in their mouth, suck their thumbs, and that's how they ingest the lead. And that's where the real danger comes from.
So some people think that it's the kid actually sucking on the windowsill or with their mouth or whatever, and they're ingesting the actual chip. Is there harm in that, or is it just the dust?
No, there's absolutely harm in that, but the myth is that that's the only way to get it. Some people, I hear people say all the time to me, well, just don't let your kids eat lead paint chips and you'll be fine. Not really. All they have to do is touch the floor, crawl on the floor, put their hands in their mouth, suck their thumbs, walk around with their fists in their mouth as they're teething, and they can ingest the lead that way. It's really important, I think, to understand, why does it happen on windows? Well, it happens on windows because there's a lot of expansion and shrinkage with the hot and the cold outside versus inside. There's moisture around windows, which causes the chipping, peeling, flaking paint. So anytime you've got that defective paint, okay, it just happens to be around windows a lot, you're going to have that potential for being a lead hazard. The other thing is when you have an abrasion surface. So if you have a window that goes up and down, it's creating microscopic lead dust, even if you can't see it, just by rubbing against itself. And the same thing that might apply to a stairs or a floor that might be painted with lead paint. Constant micro abrasions can be an issue.
When they made this law, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the law, 78 was the cutoff. How did they know this stuff was bad back then?
The interesting thing is France outlawed lead paint in 1898. There was plenty of research and scientific evidence and anecdotal evidence that there was a problem back then. It took us to almost 100 years later for the United States of America to outlaw it, but they knew it was a problem back then. We for sure knew it was a problem even in the 40s. So what happened in the 40s is two things kind of happened. One is the war happened. So all the lead went into the bullets and the bombs and all that kind of thing. But they stopped using lead paint on the interior of the properties in the early 40s, but still use it on the exterior of the properties because that's where the lead really protected well against the weather. If you see the advertisements of the paint cans and the commercials and the newspaper ads from 80 to 100 years ago, I'm talking like back in 1920, they say, you paint the outside of your house with this lead paint, we'll guarantee it for 20 years. With all the technology we have today, you can't get more than 2, 3, 4, 5 years out of an exterior painted surface before it starts to deteriorate.
Sure.
That's how good lead paint was at doing its job of protecting the wood against the elements.
Do you know why they said, hey, this stuff is, taking advice from France? Or, were people getting sick?
Well, what they really noticed they started to notice it back in like the 1600s in the painters, because the painters would be dying with such poisoned bodies at such an early age. And that started to create the quote research, whatever you want to call it back then. And then the more research they did, the more evidence was that this was a real problem. And what it does is it affects your brain development. So the body mistakes it for iron. Iron, obviously you need iron to grow. It mistakes and it absorbs the lead paint in a young developing nervous system and brain, and it actually disables you mentally. So you see a lot of aggressive behavior. You see a lot of lower IQs, that kind of thing. It's hard to pinpoint, but it's very obvious over the course of a spectrum of hundreds of thousands of children over the decades.
Yeah. So, I've heard it may be one of the causes of ADHD.
Yep.
They say that people with lead paint poisoning have, daytime drowsiness. They have a hard time, getting up and getting ready and going out. So you say they stopped using it in 1940s inside the house?
Yeah. So that's a rule of thumb. So just us based on doing tens of thousands of inspections, that's what we've kind of found, is that in the early 40s, 42, 43, 44, they stopped using lead paint on the interior. And then they stopped using it on the exterior in the mid to late 60s.
So why 1978? If your house was built, pre 1978, that's when, you need all these disclosures.
So that's when the law went into effect that forbid it to be sold for lead paint. So I think in the late 60s, they were told to stop manufacturing lead paint, but they needed almost 10 years to work the lead paint through the distribution systems. And so after 1978, they actually had to pull it off the shelves. The reality is we find very few houses in the 1970s that have lead paint. It does happen, but it's very few.
Yeah, and we get asked a lot, so we'll have a landlord or somebody that wants to invest, and they'll say, well, I only want, to look at properties that were built after 78. And we're saying, hey, look, it doesn't mean, it could be 1965 and not have lead paint, correct?
Correct. And even if there is some lead paint, it might be very minor on the exterior. You just have to pay for the test. So if you're committed to have something lead-free and you're going to buy pre-78, you're just going to have to kind of gut up and pay the $300 to $350 to have it tested, so that it is lead-free, or you can make it lead-free based on what you find in that test.
So who's at the most risk? I hear children that are in their developmental years. So is that true?
Yes.
Are adults at risk? Am I at risk?
So, as a rule of thumb, we're talking kids ages 0 through 6 and pregnant women. People like you, Todd, would not be at risk. You could be at risk if you were a contractor dealing with lead paint every day.
Okay.
Where you could breathe in and you're sanding and scraping and throwing the lead dust up in the air and then breathing it in. So that could be an issue. But 99.99% of the time, it's really from like 6 months to 3 years where I see all the elevated blood levels for lead paint. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean you can't get it when you're 4, 5, or 6, or when you're 3 months, but you see this huge spike between 6 months and 36 months.
So how about the do-it-yourself project person that, they're renovating the house that they're living in, and it is a 1920s or 30s house, may have lead paint in there. And so you say, I'm not at risk as an adult, and a contractor that does it every single day. But what type of precautions should people be taking if they're renovating their home and they have lead paint?
So what they discovered in the studies is that most white collar people or families, if they do get lead paint poisoning, they get it through doing renovations to the house. And sometimes, and so that could be, disturbing the paint, right? Making, chipping, peeling, sanding it or scraping it, throwing it up in the air. It goes out into the different rooms. Maybe you're not using plastic. What I see a lot is I see a homeowner take on a project, him or herself, and take 2 years to finish it. So at least when the contractor comes in, even if the contractor doesn't do it the right way, it's done incorrectly. There's lead dust everywhere, but then it gets cleaned up immediately, and you're pretty safe. But if you do it and you're taking time, you get distracted for 6 months, that's when you could actually create a real lead hazard, because elevated blood levels, i.e. lead poisoning, happens as a rule of thumb over prolonged exposure. It doesn't happen just touching one time and putting your hands in your mouth. So if you're disturbing your kitchen and you're doing a little bit of work every day and you keep creating lead dust, that's what can create the problem over days, weeks, months, etc.
Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.